For those ladies and gentlemen looking to optimize their debuffs and improve their PvP performance, we'll go over some practical tips to help you out with that. Hi, and welcome to Red Evony. I am Akayasha. You can call me Aka. Now, at this point, you probably have several of your Sub-City generals dressed up in full Achaemenid gear. And if you've done it right, your Sub-City generals will be looking something like this. You will have these 4 pieces on your generals, and you will likely have more courageous Achaemenid rings for range attack debuffs. For your weapon, you will likely be alternating between the Achaemenid axe and the Achaemenid spear. This setup is perfectly fine and is what I, and in fact most people, will advocate for you to go for. By now, you've probably also tried out this setup in PvP situations like Battlefield or SVS, and with some decent results, I hope. Now, before you even consider optimizing your Sub-City debuffs, you must have been paying good attention to your battle reports and looking at what your max debuff values currently are. So, right now, you're thinking about how to push things even further. First, you need to note which of your relevant debuff stats are lagging behind. These may be things like mounted HP, mounted attack, ground attack, those kind of debuffs, depending on what your Sub-City generals are and what your debuff gear looks like. So, the first point of optimization will come from reviewing your Sub-City generals. Here, I'll use some examples from when I started optimizing my debuffs. What you need to do here is to look at your Sub-City generals for which generals you could possibly replace for other ones that will provide some of the relevant debuffs that you want. In my case, I started out with 2 Sixes and 1 Arminius in my Sub-Cities. This was fine for me when I started out. However, when I started optimizing my debuffs, I wanted to try to boost my ground attack debuffs and my mounted attack debuffs. Fortunately, I was at a point where my ranged troop attack debuffs and my ground defense debuffs were high enough that replacing my Sixes and my Arminius would not have had a significant effect on my debuff stats. So, based on the options available to me, I replaced my Sixes with 2 Margarets and replaced my Arminius with Wei Queen. Wei Queen gives ground attack and mounted attack debuffs, and Margaret gives a bit to all attack debuffs and mounted attack debuffs. So, this fit perfectly fine with my plans. For you, depending on the generals you currently have, your focus might be a bit different. You might, for example, want more range attack debuffs, so you might be looking at generals like Andrew Jackson, Baldwin, Knut the Great, or any good generals with decent range attack debuffs. In a completely different scenario, you might be trying to focus on HP debuffs. So you might be looking at generals like Herald or Nero. This will entirely depend on the current state of your debuffs, which is why it is very important that you are paying close attention to them at all times. The next point you will want to look at for optimization is your sub-general gear. One inherent issue with the basic debuff gear setup that we've looked at is that debuffs for mounted HP will lag with this basic setup. As such, instead of focusing on gearing all your Sub-City generals with the courageous Achaemenid ring, you might want to add some fearless Achaemenid rings to your setup. The plus side of going with the fearless Achaemenid ring is that you get the required mounted HP debuffs. The downside is you lose out on the range attack debuffs from the courageous Achaemenid ring. So, before you make this switch, you need to ensure that your range attack debuffs are decently high enough. We're looking at minimum 400%. Now, if you just replace the ring and go with the same gear pieces that we've had, you will still end up with the 6-piece Achaemenid set attribute of 15% attack debuff for all troops. This will, of course, help with pushing your range attack and other attack debuffs even further. However, if you would like to take a different approach and try to boost your mounted HP debuffs while also trying to get as much range attack debuffs as possible, here is something you could do. You have your general, and we can start off with the Fearless Achaemenid ring as we stated earlier. Then you will have some of the same pieces that will remain the same from the previous setup. So we're looking at the Courageous Achaemenid boots, the Courageous Achaemenid helmet, and the Fearless Achaemenid leg armor. For most people, these 3 pieces will remain exactly the same. Now, here's the twist. For the weapon, since you are trying to boost mounted HP debuffs, you don't want to go with the Achaemenid weapon. Here, you would want to go with an Ares weapon. Yep, that's right. And some old school players will already know this. There are some Ares gear pieces that have built-in debuffs. So, for the weapon, you would want to go with the Ares sword. The Ares sword will give you an additional 33% debuff to mounted troop HP. Finally, when we go to the chest armor, here again, you will be going for Ares gear instead of Achaemenid gear. For this, you'll be looking at the Fearless Ares armor for 30% range attack debuff. With all that said, here is what the final setup will look like. So, what are the pros and cons of this setup? For the pros, as opposed to the full Achaemenid setup that we looked at earlier, with this setup, you get 33% more mounted HP debuff and you get 15% more range attack debuff. The cons for this setup, you lose the 6-piece Achaemenid set attribute of 15% troop attack debuff for all troops. So, if you're looking to get this setup, I would advise that you limit this to only a few of your Sub-City generals. No more than 3. In my case, I have 9 subs and I have 2 of my sub-generals geared up like this. Finally, one important point that you need to take away from this is that while it is important to follow the standard setup for gearing up your Sub-City generals, do not be afraid to break the setup and optimize your gear to fit the specific needs for your keep. Everyone's needs are different, so make sure you adjust to what you specifically need. But remember, you need to limit this kind of changes to only a few generals. The standard setup is standard for a good reason, and that is because it works well for most people. Please remember that. If you like the content to this video, do remember to give it a like. And if you would like to know more about understanding debuffs and how to improve your debuffs beyond your sub-cities, you can check out my video here. Thank you very much. Aka signing out.